Thank you, Tim. Awesome. Okay, let's get started. So then, yeah, thanks for a lovely introduction, Tim. As Tim says, my name is Phil Hawksworth, and indeed, I do work at an agency in London. It's an American agency, but we're based in London, or I'm based in London, rather. RGA makes stuff for clients. We make things for the web, we make applications, we make products, services, all kinds of bits and pieces, but I care mostly about the web. Before we get going, I should mention, probably not going to have time for Q&A. I'm going to try and squeeze in as much as I can. But if you do have questions along the way, shout them at me on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is just my name, Phil Hawksworth. So yeah, any questions, comments, arguments, if you disagree, great, chuck them at me on Twitter. Suggestions for things to improve. Coping with the caffeine, I'd like some suggestions on that, because as Tim mentioned, wow, I had one this morning out there, and I can see through time. It was so strong. So the heart's going a little bit. So yeah, so before we kick off, I should probably start with a bit of an apology, because we've just seen an amazing talk from Rachel. And then, lots of things that were very bright and visual and all about movement. And then I come along with this, which, the temperature in the room has changed a little bit. And I was thinking, well, how do I sex this up a little bit? I can't just call it static sites or static site generators. So I was thinking of different titles. At one point, I was thinking, well, dynamic static site strategies, which apart from being really difficult to say, doesn't mean a lot. So I discarded that. I was thinking, well, static site generators, I could call it SSG Whiz, kind of being a bit playful, but then realized that that just sounds like the worst possible name for a battleship, so I discarded SSG Whiz, gone with static sites go all Hollywood, hoping you won't notice that that doesn't mean anything either, and hoping I'll kind of entice you in along the way. After Rachel's talk, I realized that I have to do something a little bit visual, so I'll be using a device, bright colors, and I may also throw in some big fonts along the way. If you're really lucky, at some point I might double up and go for both bright fonts and big colors. So brace yourselves. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, I'm just going to do a little bit of context first and just mention a couple of kind of previous rants and previous opinions of mine. As Tim mentioned, there's some kind of values that I espouse quite regularly. And I, like a lot of people I'm sure in this room, I love the web. I love everything about the web, and I kind of really care for its existence. I care a lot about things like URLs, even though URLs have been tainted for me after some conversations with Alex Sexton, who introduced this concept to me. Has anyone seen this before? The all URL starts with HTTP double meh. And once you've seen it, once you see him, here he is. You can't unsee. That is with you forever. So apologies for that. That doesn't really contribute to this talk, but I just need to share that pain. That's with you all for now. I've spoken in the past at various events about content management systems and the difficulty that they bring along. And all of the things that I tend to talk about really come down to the crux of it, which is building for the web is hard. There's a lot to think about. And whether that's to do with dealing with the different devices that we have to build things to work on, the ones that we know about now and the ones that are coming up in the future, or if we're thinking about how we cater for all of the different viewports that things have to go onto, we don't really know what the landscape is that we're building for. So this is pretty challenging stuff. So that's a long animation. So really, the way I think about this is that, from the front end to the back end, we've got a full stack of tools and complexities and different things that we have to solve. And complexity is a killer. Complexity can be really tough. And I'm always looking for ways to reduce complexity. Now, I see that as an opportunity to remove, an obstruction to quality. Because we're building something, that complexity can get in the way of sustaining that quality. And it also is an opportunity to remove obstructions to longevity. If we want to build something for the web, we want it to be around for a while. We don't want it to be just a flash in the pan and gone. Some sites, that's fine, if it's related to a campaign or something that's just going to be there briefly. But for the most part, we want things that are going to sustain. So, whoops. So, bam, there he is. So we're probably familiar with this site, right? The first website. And this is still around. We can still see this. Everyone's seen this before. And this is still around because, first of all, it adheres to the web standards that it was part of setting up, but also it's very, very simple. This kind of idea of simplicity helps this to sustain. And this kind of idea of simplicity and kind of fitting the complexity to what we're building was espoused by Aaron Swartz a long time ago when he kind of coined this term of bake, don't fry. And this came when he was thinking about how he was going to better run his blog. He had a blog that was very successful, lots of opinions on there, lots of audience, but it was a pain in the neck to sustain. So, he wrote an article about it, and he was saying, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs. I'm with him completely. I can feel that pain. And it's not new thinking. This is what he was saying in 2002. And really what he's talking about here is finding something which is the best fit for his purpose. And at the time, he was thinking, well, I've got a blog site that has a particular profile, that has a few rights, I don't blog that often, and it has many reads and many eyeballs. So finding something that is a fit for that profile of site is really important. And then as it turns out, he stumbled upon something called WebMake, which is a static site generator, essentially, that was written in Perl back in 2002. And that's what kind of moved him along. And this kind of comment about simplicity critically is not dumbing down. I think it's really important to note that. And while, yes, this site might look a little bit dumbed down, and it's a difficult aesthetic to sell to a creative director or to a client, but at its heart, simplicity is not dumbing down. Simplicity is something that lets us focus on what matters. We get some of the noise out of the way. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why static site generators can be a good fit for certain things, and also what we can do with them. So before I dive into that, I just want to comment a little bit about some of the benefits of static site generators and serving sites statically. So I'll rattle through these quite quickly. So first of all, if we're going to serve sites as static assets, we've got access to much cheaper, much simpler hosting. Sometimes it can be free, sometimes it can be inexpensive. We don't have a lot of mechanics working in the background, so it's much simpler and cheaper to host these kind of things. As a result, of this simplicity, we've got fewer points of failure in the hosting environment. There are less moving parts, so less things to go wrong. Another attribute of that simplicity is that there are fewer vulnerabilities. There are less things to attack from the back end, less things that are dynamic and might take input and then produce a different output. So there are fewer attack vectors for people potentially trying to disrupt that site. A side effect of that, again, is that there's easier compliance. Now, wow, I talked about things being dry after Rachel's talk, and the line easier compliance definitely isn't a crowd pleaser. But if you're building anything for a large company and maybe having to host it in their environment, they'll really go through this with a fine tooth comb, thinking about how your infrastructure is set up and how things can be safe. So having a simple architecture can make this a much easier probability. An easier prospect, rather. And so also, we're able to move these things around. We're not coupled to a very complex hosting infrastructure. So actually moving things from one place to another and redeploying them can be much, much simpler, which is actually a huge advantage. And critically, the one that I like the most is that you can avoid attrition. And what I mean by that is, when you've created something and you're hosting it, you put it up there and you step away from it for a while, often over time, that environment can get dusty. Maybe the dependencies of the mechanics behind the scenes kind of move on, and you have to patch things and move things on. I'm assuming that since we have a lot of developers in the room, there's probably quite a few people who at some point have had or now have a blog. Can I see a raise of hands? People who have at some point had well, only a few people have had a blog. Maybe everyone's on other things now, but okay, so a handful of people have had a blog at one point. Many people used WordPress. Show of hands? Okay, yeah, okay, many more of you, somehow. So many people might have seen a page like this at some point, as you're working on WordPress, or this one I particularly love. I love this one because of the fact that it goes error, 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 success, which is kind of confusing. This is an example of, the infrastructure behind the scenes having some problems or maybe degrading over time. Now, I want to be really clear, I'm not bashing WordPress. WordPress is an incredible product that I've used for all kinds of things. But I'm just trying to use this to illustrate the point that when there are moving parts in the background, especially when it seems simple to use, they're things that you have to maintain. And if you don't maintain them, then you can get into issues. So I just want to talk a little bit about credibility and whether or not static sites are really ready for prime time. Now, there's some kind of anecdotal examples that have been around for a while, and this is one that many people have seen. I think this is from 2012, so cutting-edge stuff today. But this example still stands up really beautifully because this is a case study for the site that was put together for fundraising for the Obama campaign. Again, not that topical. But this is a site that was built using Jekyll, a static site generator, and it replaced something that was much heavier in terms of the infrastructure that was there before. And when this was live, even though it was a static site, the simplicity and the architecture of how this was built meant that it could go through many, many iterations. So over 6 months, it had hundreds of iterations of new deployments. And it was a site that served nearly 18 million uniques over that 6 months period with nearly 82 million page views. And this was 60% faster than the infrastructure that it replaced just by being on a simple static architecture. As I mentioned, it was baked with Jekyll, had a large audience, and it had lots of rapid iterations, and it was served statically. Another example I like to kind of mention, mostly because it's one that I worked on at RGA, was something that was built for Google at the end of 2014. And this was the year in search, it was called. It was their annual kind of zeitgeist site that reviewed all of the search results and the stories behind them. And this is a site that, again, had a large audience. It was an audience that would peak at the end of the year and have a very large set of attention there and then have a long tail afterwards. It was infrequently updated because once it was published, and it was published on top of a content management workflow, once it was published, it was going to be kind of stable, and it would have this kind of long life where you should be able to always return to it. So it's a similar kind of profile of a few writes and many, many reads. In terms of the content, they had 40 different stories, so not a lot of content, but it was long-form content. But then all of those stories were translated into 52 languages. In the first 6 weeks, it got a ton of impressions on social that drove a lot of traffic there, and it had to stand up to it. So it had a particular profile that we had to satisfy. Now, in this case, since there were lots of authors working on this, we need to abstract the content out of the framework that we used to build it. It was built using a Python-based static site generator, and again, served statically. And this held up really beautifully. So the point I'm trying to illustrate with those couple of examples is that static sites are already mainstream, and they are, I think, ready for prime time. It's a case of how do we use them. Most of the conversations I have when I'm trying to push for this kind of architecture where I see an opportunity, a client will say, that's fine, but we need something much more powerful for my project. And the question I'm trying to ask at this point is, but do you? And I think there are opportunities, and those come from a bunch of different enablers. And a couple of enablers that I think many of us have played with are the kind of the generators and the templating tools that are starting to exist now. When I say starting to exist, there are a lot of these things around. Static-site-generators.net lists as many as they can find. 393 on here, but then this slide is a couple of months old. Now there are 428. It's one of those slides where there's no point trying to quote the number here because people are just building them and building them and building them. They're scratching that itch. So I'm going to start to express this just as n, where n is the last count that I used, and then I'll just add in some random variable like, I don't know, the number of giant disco balls in the room. So for this conference, 428 becomes 429. Congratulations on the giant disco ball, by the way. It's amazing. But this kind of churn, this kind of expanding marketplace of these static site generators, there's a risk there. I kind of talk sometimes about this temptation to follow what's fashionable and play with the latest tool. I kind of talk about, the hipster tax that you can get sucked into, because whenever you see a new shiny toy, you go, well, I'll now try using this one. It sounds cooler than the last one. And there's a bit of an overhead there, so just a kind of word of warning. But these tools do bring out all kinds of great possibilities. And something that we're seeing much more in building for the web now is style guides and living style guides. And when you're building with some of these static site generators, you can kind of have a style guide that comes as a side effect or as an artifact But probably better expressed, it's really style guide as a process. You can build things as a style guide that then lives on into your production site. Nicole Sullivan sometimes talks about style guide-driven development, which I really like. And there's a watch out here. There's a really important thing to consider. So I just want to talk a tiny bit about how style guides can come into existence. Because often what we'll do when we're creating a style guide is we'll think about the components and the modules. We might be trying to adopt an atomic design approach. So we'll have these pieces that will form the styles across our site. And we'll build some templates that maybe will express those as a style guide. And then through some kind of automated build and a static site generator, what we can do is we can generate our style guide. Fantastic. Through that build automation, we may put some deployment processes in there. So again, we can publish our style guide easily and people can see them. But the critical thing is, unless these modules are actually part of your core build, there's a real risk that they'll go dusty and go out of shape there. So really what's important is that when we use this mechanic, this is the same mechanic that we're using to build our production site. So as we add more templates and more things that describe the actual site, and we add in our content, this goes through the same mechanic to generate our production site. It's really important that those two things don't fork and become separated. And then perhaps we'll have some kind of optimization for the output of the production site. So there are examples of this out in the world, in the wild. Lonely Planet, of course, has a great example. I believe the FT has got a great example as well. The Times in the UK has published some examples of this recently as well. So yeah, the point I'm trying to get across here is that unless it's part of your build, your style guide is just more documentation for you to maintain. And static site generators can really help you kind of maintain that as part of your larger build environment. Gina Bolton sometimes talks about zombie style guides, where people start with the best of intentions, but then they just kind of fall by the wayside. Anna Debenham expressed it really nicely. Style guides, it's a system, it's a living, breathing library of components, and that's critical if it's going to stay alive. And so part of keeping that alive is the automation that exists. And this is something that's key to the success of static sites as something that could be a little bit more dynamic. Automation can reduce friction greatly. There are loads of tools that you'll have found for automating tasks. Grunt's popular, Gulp's popular, there's Brunch, soon there'll be Belch, there'll be Burp, there'll be Cough, there'll be Sneeze. I'm assuming, again, we're in the hipster tax zone there. But when Cough comes along, you're going to be first to learn it and migrate away from Gulp if you're anything like me. But the fantastic thing is that whatever the tool is that we use there, it gives us opportunities to deploy much faster and deploy much more safely. Reducing friction and building confidence with these tools means that you can update things much, much faster, so you can get things out live. And then a site that is built on a static architecture can actually feel much more dynamic because it's easier to update. And there are some great tools around that you can use for this. Serge is a great one. Has anyone experimented with Serge? Anyone? A few hands around. Serge is great. Actually, one of the contributors to Serge is around at the conference and speaking tomorrow, so Kenneth can speak eloquently about this, I'm sure. But for me, I think it's just summarizing quickly, it's just a wonderful tool to very, very quickly take a static site, a folder on your environment, and with a few commands, deploy it to an environment. It just takes that friction away and can be really, really useful in keeping things very, very dynamic and easy to deploy. So this is all well and good, but ultimately, we end up hitting a bit of a ceiling there because these kind of tools kind of require a bit of a developer mindset. We're developers, we're kind of comfortable with these tools and these processes, but a developer mindset isn't always very Hollywood. It doesn't always match with the aspirations of the client. The client will still want that shizzle, that exciting stuff in the browser, and also clients they're going to want to manage the content themselves. I won't go down that route of a CMS talk, but it's never far from what's on my mind. So given that, let's just look a little bit at some common complexity in sites that aren't static. So if we think of a scenario where we've got some views that we want to render out and show to a user, and those views maybe sit on top of some server logic, some logic there that takes the data that exists, and according to the URL or the intent of the user, they're going to generate a view and render that out. If we're good, we've probably got some kind of caching layer in front of that as well. Now, in order to serve that and make it maintainable, often there'll be some kind of CMS, which means there'll be an admin view as well. And that admin UI needs to have some views of its own to control it, which again sits on some kind of server logic, which again is manipulating the data and the configuration of the site and the content. And this is, I mean, obviously this is very, very simplified, but you can wrap that up in a nice, tidy bubble and call that, okay, that's our production environment. And if we're going to build on this over a period of time, we're probably going to want to replicate all of that into a staging environment. And if we're going to want to test that, we're probably going to want to replicate all of that into a suitable QA environment. And if we want to build that, we probably need to replicate all of that into some kind of development environment. So there's a lot of potential moving parts and complexity here and things to provision. So I always look at something like that and think, well, can we reduce the complexity? And I think there is a solution for that using static sites, but we still need to cater for a lot of those use cases. So for me, what I like to do is think about other people's plumbing. Now, other people's plumbing is another unsavory term that I'm kind of cautious to stand and use, but it's an idea of kind of moving into using other people's complexity instead of adopting it ourselves. So let's step through a picture of what that might look like. So in this time, instead of starting at the production environment, I'm going to start thinking about the developer environment and the developer view first. So here, obviously I'm espousing static site generators, so I'm going to base this on a static site generator of some sort and the build mechanics that are there and part of it that ultimately will render out a page that will host somewhere, wherever that's going to be. Hosting of static sites is kind of commoditized now, so that could be on S3 or could be on our own infrastructure, it could be anywhere. And that ultimately will get rendered out to the user. Now, the content I've pulled out of our environment here because I think there's an opportunity for the management of the content to be something that we don't have to deal with. Rather than us having to build and maintain and serve an admin UI, there's opportunities for someone else to do that for us. So if we do that, then through this content management system, which is externalized, that can serve content to our development environment. It can expose APIs of the content that we use to generate our site and then build it out statically. Now, what I've just popped up there a bit earlier as well is that then we can think about, well, maybe we can automate the deployment of this as well. So rather than us just pulling the content in, running our build, and then manually popping it out, that's a very simplistic way of looking at deploying a site, but simply deploying it to our production environment, we can outsource the deployment of this as well to deployment as a service. And so there are things that exist there as well where, rather than us handling that, we're already pushing our code to a version repository. And so the deployment as a service can be monitoring that for updates and then also monitoring the content changes. When either of those things is changed, that can run the same build that we're running in our development environment and output a static asset. So that's all well and good, but you might look at this and go, well, hang on, Phil, that's not simplifying at all. There are still lots of lines and boxes on there. But actually, I think it's about shifting the complexity into someone else's responsibility. There are organizations that specialize in just these things that otherwise you'd have to do. If you can outsource some of that complexity and put some distance between the user and the complexity, that's a huge win. Rather than sourcing the content and building the views at runtime, if you can do that at build time and decouple these things, then your risk goes through the floor. And there are some companies that do this for you. Contentful is a great one, which I've had some great success with. It's a hosted content management tool, and they do a beautiful job. It gives you this interface so you don't have to build one yourself, and exposes your content through an API. Now, it supports translation, so you can have lots of different localizations as well, and it takes care of user roles and management and all of the kind of craft that you have to build if you're going to build a CMS. Critically also, it supports different environments and versioning, so you can have staged content and all of that kind of rich flow that you'd need from something that was a content management server. Whoops, but the key thing, if I can get my build right, there we go, is that it decouples the content administration from the production environment. So your static server can do this for you without being anywhere near the production environment. So this box over here kind of gets filled in by this one of many potential companies. And if you're using a a static site generator like Decouple, which is very popular. There are already tools that exist to help you pull the content from Contentful, which is, again, a RESTful API, and then include that in your site generation. So this is kind of taken care of. So if we then look at this opportunity here for the hosting and the deployment, well, these are something that we can pull together. I think of Hosting Plus or Hosting with Benefits. There are companies here, again, that are filling in this space, and I really like Netlify. There are a few kind of filling in this kind of space, but Netlify is one that I particularly like, which will monitor your repo and then trigger the exact same build that you have running in your development environment. So it can trigger the build and then deploy to your environment, or indeed it can serve it itself. It's a great CDN as well. So that can be monitoring either your repository or your content pool, or ideally both. So if changes are made, it can build out your static site for you and publish it. So a static site that might feel very baked and static and not very dynamic can suddenly become something that's published very often and start to feel very rich. So Netlify offers webhooks, and it can bring you notifications so that you can choose to do things automatically or have them signed off and then go through the build. It gives you control of the headers for the hosting environment, and other nice things like gives you basic authentication, supports HTTPS. So it starts to become a really good kind of one-stop for lots of your static site serving needs. So this kind of approach, I think, is incredibly powerful and can make things feel really, really dynamic. But of course, it has limitations. Static sites are poor when it comes to doing things such as personalization. And many of the projects that I work on have this at its heart. People say, we want to have content which is personalized to the user. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. There are lots of sites that I think we work on which actually don't necessarily need content to be created and personalized to individuals, in which case this could still be an option. Very, very large sites with tens of thousands of pages, like news sites, potentially wouldn't ideally work on here because it's a static site generator that needs to bake out all of these pages each time you make a change, so that could be a limitation. And anywhere where we're gathering user-generated content, something that really is truly dynamic and responding to the user, perhaps not the best fit. But best fit is the key. When we look at what the opportunities are, we really need to think, is this a contender for simplification? And you have to consider every project in its own right. But my message really is just don't default to the maximum complexity. If there are any chances to simplify, we should pursue those. And that's fine, but for some reason we're still shying away from saying, okay, we can make this something that's static. And there is a bit of an issue with the perception of static sites, I think. We're already thinking of them being kind of static, flat, simple, basic. But as I was saying earlier on, it doesn't actually mean that we're dumbing down. It just means that we can focus on the performance, the animation, all of the other rich things around the site, the content. We can focus our effort on some of those things. Now, I think that a static hosted site can be just as dynamic as the tools we build to use them, particularly as they enable a process. But this word static is kind of hanging around. So I kind of think it's time to rebrand these a little bit. Maybe this is my background at an agency that's kind of singing through. I actually spoke to one of the founders of Netlify almost 2 years ago now, Matthias Billman, and he was very much of this opinion, saying, the word static's a problem. He rebadged this the jam stack, which I really like because, well, I like jam and it sounds cool. So this is great for me. He was talking about JavaScript, APIs, and markup as the model for this, rather than static. The tools and the building blocks that I've been talking about are encapsulated by those three things very often. So I kind of like this approach of talking about it a bit differently. Matthias has a great presentation, which you can find there. I'll share the links to this afterwards, which I'd recommend checking out. But it's bigger than just JavaScript, right? So I'm not sure if the jam stack is the way to go. JavaScript has come a long way and do a lot of things. Years ago when I was writing lots of JavaScript, I used to have conversations with people where I'd say, yeah, I'm a software engineer. Oh, what language do you work in? I work in JavaScript. And then they'd have this kind of reaction. It was a few kindred spirits in the room as well who've been stung by this. And it's come a long way now. I think we accept that JavaScript can do a great deal more than perhaps we used to do in the past. But static site generators are built in more than just JavaScript now. So I kind of think about the short stack. You know, it's all about opportunities to make this full stack more manageable. You know, taking some of the complexity away, either outsourcing it or removing it completely. And I think the opportunity to talk about a shorter stack where we can focus our attention is kind of where I'm looking a little bit. So I'm kind of just about out of time, so let me just wrap up. I think that simplifying production environments is a huge win. And while it doesn't feel necessarily that sexy, it's a great opportunity for us to have higher confidence and higher publishing rates in the kind of things that we work on. I think it's important to put distance between your users and the complexity, making sure that the bottlenecks and the failure points are as far away from what you host as possible, and static site generators can help with that. The landscape of static site generating tools and the build automation is just maturing at such a rate that the tools really do exist now for us to build things with great performance and with great dependability during that production process. And the tools that are starting to exist to support us in this, you know, these outsourced tools, a couple of which I've mentioned today, are really starting to fill the gap of where some of that shortfall is. So I guess my final message really is, you know, with a shorter stack, things can be made a lot more simple and a lot more powerful. So I have a bunch of links that you might find useful if you're interested in learning more about this. These slides, or a version of these slides, is already online here, and I'll be updating those later on towards the end of the day. Apologies, I don't have any time for any questions right now, but absolutely grab me while I'm around. I might treat myself to another one of those rocket fuel coffees later on. So I'll be around outside. Grab me for questions. Thanks ever so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.